Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It is a Thursday morning here in Minnesota, in the middle of July. It's actually a pretty cool, crisp, early fall feeling morning, even though we're still definitely midsummer. And for those of you who think Minnesota is just a snowy wilderness, which it is 4 months of the year, we're continental in our climate, so we get some pretty extreme heat here in the summer, uh, tornadoes and incredible weather systems. It's kind of crazy watching the climate change. But we've had some pretty hot days and some pretty crazy windstorms, and our entire month of May was one of the windiest months on record. Just wind every day, whipping and blowing. So the weather's interesting no matter where you live right now in the world. It's reflecting some dangerous trends without any kind of question. Speaking of dangerous trends, today's episode I want to focus on two things. Some new records I got I'm going to show you, but also I want to talk about a discussion me and my good friend Ken McAuliffe have been having over the last few days. And from my perspective, and from a lot of the commenters that I've talked with, either via Messenger or Facebook or even on the comments on episodes, I've always felt there was a peer pressure in jazz. And it pressures people into liking out. And it's more out than it is the avant-garde and free. And I think that's partly why I've always taken a stance that you don't have to like that stuff to be a jazz fan. And that's something I've always kind of said on this channel. You don't have to be a monocle wearing, I like so sophisticated. That doesn't have to be sophisticated. You can like the blues. You can like a simple swing, a pop melody. Jazz has so much to offer. There's no music on the planet that has a wider range of sounds and colors and instruments and ways for you to perform it. There's nothing that touches it. Classical, for all its variants, to me is a small sounding niche compared to the variance that happens in jazz. From the aloof, delicate thunder of Ellington, to the hard driving swing of Basie, to the minute melancholy of Gil Evans and Miles Davis sketches of Spain, to hard driving bebop of Art Blakey, to Charlie Parker and Clifford Brown playing with strings, yet still absolutely blooming the blues over top of those strings. From the pop of Ella Fitzgerald, from the sorrow of Billie Holiday, to the joy of a Frank Sinatra and a Dean Martin, to the absolute hard swing of Benny Goodman, Sing, Sing, Sing. Imagine a dubstep remix of Sing, Sing, Sing. And there's that electronic swing band that plays with horns. It's all horns. It's all analog produced sounds and mute, like Germany, Hamburg. I would love to hear them do Sing, Sing, Sing. It's such a badass production. Fletcher Henderson arranged it. It was done by numerous people. Gene Krupa with the thunder on the drums. Sing, Sing, Sing is just incredible. And if you, in your ears, hear it, listen to it, and recognize that today those same sounds and swells and counter movements would be done all digitally with different sounds, but they're still the same movements and shapes and sounds and pulses. From the slowest melancholy of a blues-driven guitarist, some Kenny Burrell, Wes Montgomery, Grant Green, to the gospel that infuses so much of this music, including guys like Grant Green and soul jazz. It's just, there's so many different colors that jazz has to offer. And like I've said before, you could do entire soundtracks to films with the varied nature of jazz. It doesn't need to be, yet in so many people's minds, it's limited to one or two things, jazz. A guy like Charlie Mingus, you take his great album, The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, and that record itself is a soundtrack with all this kind of pastoral, quiet movements and then these hard driving dissonant areas that just overwhelm you. Monk with his tinkling along the piano like a stray cat in an alleyway, jumping on a piano and ding dong ding tong tong. Jazz has so much variety to it, and it's something I think is lost on us as beginners in jazz, and we don't really grasp just how varied the landscape is. And for some of us, even the landscape's very disillusioned in a way. For example, Bitches Brew, Miles Davis alone, kind of blue, Sketches of Spain. He sets these parameters that are really broad, and he's often outskirts of jazz with what he's doing. Sketches of Spain is, Porgy and Bess even more so. It has a lot of European tradition soundscape happening, classical, theatrical, and a lot less of the blues and the swing going on. But we come to that stuff early in our jazz journey, and I think it shapes and influences what we think is jazz and how jazz sounds. And it's as broad as we want it to be, or as narrow as we want it to be. But it's a super... I mean, I could really give different jazz songs for any kind of part of a soundtrack to a film. From Danger to Romance. From Nocturnal Sleep to the largest bar brawl. You could put jazz to just anything. It's got all of those tempos and sounds and emotional landscapes in it. So me and Ken, though, have been having this discussion, and I think there's a real peer pressure within the jazz community, the jazz industry, the vinyl community, the internet, YouTube channels, that's pressuring people into certain aspects of the music. One being the new releases, which the industry is driving that to keep, it's a marketing thing, and it impacts people because a lot of us are consumers first. We're consumers ahead of love of music, apparently, for a lot of folks. There's a lot of research out there that are selling for a lot of money. You still find a lot of great jazz for $2, $3, $5, $10 on Discogs if you look. If you want to branch out beyond what the status quo is all talking about. So I think there's a desire to fit in. I think there's a desire to be able to communicate with others about this new hobby. So we end up buying the same couple hundred records, almost everybody, first. And I think that's been in place for quite a while. I came into jazz 20-some years ago, and even then there was this Miles into Coltrane into the out, avant-garde, free, new thing. Miles pushes into fusion, Bitches Brew, and all that, diaspora. And we kind of stay 60 to possibly the present. What's pre-fusion, what's pre-even hard bop. I mean, hard bop is too primal for a lot of people, and a lot of people don't even understand when they listen to it. Bebop and swing, the small group, a lot of that stuff is just very distant from people, and they don't know, they don't understand much about it. And I've always tried to be a voice saying that this stuff has just as much value, and for a lot of it was a bigger part of the jazz world than this small window that we're staring into. I mean, we're seeing a small piece of the jazz puzzle when we limit ourselves to 1965 to 1975. And same goes for 55 to 65. Like I said, there's so much jazz on both sides of that. And, of course, jazz still has various life forms today, but I don't really see it being as vital and as alive as a lot of people want to claim it is. The average person still can't name 3 jazz artists today, including Miles Davis and John Coltrane. They can't. I have 3 brothers. I would guess all 3 of them would be challenged to mention 3 jazz names. Louis Armstrong, maybe Duke Ellington, maybe Miles Davis. And that's with me having talked jazz around them numerous times. For a lot of people, jazz is a notion, it's perception. It's an intellectual venture filled with kind of aloof people, which I find that to be very true. And I think it turns a lot of people off jazz. And one of my examples with Ken is a lot of times I've seen people in the Facebook jazz groups, which I'm a member of probably 30 of them. And I see these people will post, "Oh, I'm new to jazz. I'm really digging it so far. I have this one record by so and so. Where should I go next? Where should I start my jazz journey? And the responses those questions sometimes garner just short of infuriates me. And I'm not here to call out any one person, but I think a lot of people think they're experts really quickly, and they're just going to mirror and reflect the other so-called experts who all have the same 200 records. And so when someone's asking where should I start my jazz journey, and again, this is just my opinion, but in my opinion, Sonship is a wrong answer. Sonship, no. Out to Lunch, Eric Dolphy, incorrect. Again, my opinion, but I think in our desire to want to be seen as sophisticated and intellectual and part of those who know, we often try to push some very advanced, some very complicated, some very difficult music on people. I've often seen people pushing Mingus on beginners. Bitches Brew. And I'm not going to get into the Bitches Brew debate. It's not my cup of tea. I listened to it for years. And people want to say sometimes, it takes years to get it. I listened to it for 10 years and if I feed you a meal for 10 years, and after 10 years you say, oh, I like it now, it just took me 10 years to like it, you just got used to it. You know, if you walk into a Mexican restaurant, you've never had Mexican before, and you sit down and say, I'm new to this, what would you recommend? And I give you the most extreme thing on the menu, I'm a jerk off, first of all. And second of all, you're probably not coming back to my restaurant or to Mexican food. And that's something DJing kind of helped me come along with, and understanding that my personal predilections aren't always necessarily the right opinion to share with people, and that you have to kind of put yourself into their context, where they're at in their musical journey. And so I guess I'm kind of asking you guys, do you feel there's a peer pressure in the jazz community to buy certain things, to collect certain things, to talk and post certain things? And where do you feel that peer pressure comes from? Is it from the writers and the critics over decades? Is it from the industry that's pushing and promoting and publicizing the same titles? Is it from the collectors who want to post and show their rare avant-garde, their rare out, their expensive Lee Morgan, Joe Henderson, Jackie McLean's? Where is the peer pressure coming from? And I think from my perspective, it's kind of coming from a lot of places. And the jazz canon has been shrunk down to this minuscule, somewhat marketable collection of titles that will appeal to the quote-unquote jazz fan, which is eliminating so much of the potential audience for jazz. And that's where my frustration comes in. I don't have a problem with people's opinions necessarily. I don't have a problem with people loving out or avant-garde or free. I like a lot of it. I don't push or promote it because I feel like it's getting pushed and promoted plenty. And Ken doesn't think that this is a thing. Ken thinks it's in my head to some degree. And again, I've seen these Facebook posts. Oh, I'm new to the jazz journey. What should I buy? Sonship. That one just stuck in my head. Sonship. But I've seen Out to Lunch, and I've seen a lot of really out avant-garde, free, or Nat Coleman stuff that just let someone get their foot wet. Let them get a little bit of Duke Ellington, a little bit of Kenny Burrell. Find some Joe Puma, some fun. Get jazz guitar, play around. And it's funny because that same peer pressure also exists in the negative connotation sense, in terms of a lot of these same aloof people saying, oh, Dave Brubeck's garbage. You can't collect Dave Brubeck. If you say that about Cecil Taylor, they'll lose their fucking mind. But they'll rip Dave Brubeck. And a lot of Brubeck's early stuff is some of the coolest jazz on the planet. His fantasy stuff's fantastic. And anybody who says that Take 5 and Out of Time Out isn't an incredible album isn't listening. That's an incredible record. And Paul Desmond's a delight to listen to any time of the day. Time Out is esteemed as kind of blue. It's a landmark piece. Modern Jazz Quartet, they take a lot of grief from a lot of the cool collectors. Oh, you can't, that's garbage. You don't. Milt Jackson's a legend. The rhythm section's legendary. John Lewis is a fantastic, brilliant mind who does drift from the blues at times into more European sound, but that was his mission statement with the Modern Jazz Quartet, was to try to create a quantifiable, writable jazz. And whether or not he succeeds in that is open for debate, I think. But so my question to you guys is, do you feel there's a jazz peer pressure to buy certain things, to collect certain things? And I've had a lot of people tell me they felt pressured to buy something and ended up not liking it at all, and were almost afraid to admit it at first. And I know a lot of people have come to me in comments and in messages and saying, thank you for saying what you say, because I feel like there's some stuff in my collection that I never really liked. I felt like I was supposed to like it, or I had to like it, and I don't. And you've empowered me to say I don't like it. And that's great, because that's the honesty we need. I don't think we should be always pushing the most difficult stuff on people. And I get, like, again, Ken doesn't seem to think that this exists. And so I told him next time I saw one of those posts on Facebook, I would kind of tag him in, and he could look at some of the comments that people share. Not to say there's not good suggestions in there. You know, if you're suggesting Red Garland, Wynton Kelly, Bill Evans, those are great suggestions. You know, I mean, there's great places to get people's toes wet. Some Lockjaw Davis is a great place for a lot of people to start. Charlie Rouse, yeah, that's an expensive LP, but that's a fun listen. A lot of Stan Getz, the Boston. There's a lot of places to come in and just love jazz and get comfortable with it, and then you can decide yourself where you want to go with your jazz journey. And again, I don't want to come across like I have all the knowledge and perception in the world, because this is just my perception. But even myself, 20 years ago, I felt very pressured into saying, oh yeah, I have Bitches Brew, and it's one of the best records ever. And I held that belief for 10, 12, 15 years. And finally one day I was like, you know what? I don't ever enjoy playing this. I'm always looking forward to the side being over whenever I play it. And so that supersedes the intellect of the jazz community, the vinyl community, the internet community, my own tastes. And once I was honest with myself, I felt like I needed to share that with other people, because I was so far down my jazz journey at that point. I'm like, oh man, there's probably a lot of other beginners who would like to know that. You don't have to like Out to Lunch to be a jazz fan. You don't have to dig Pithecanthus erectus to be a knowledgeable jazz fan. And honestly, the two most knowledgeable jazz fans I know, Scott Baldwin and Jean-Michel, Richard Beethoven, neither of them have much time for things that are really out, the avant-garde, or feel the need to post boasting records all the time. You know, I mean, Scott's always trying to teach people. Jean-Michel is always commenting on teaching people. And I've tried to always be someone who teaches people as well. And again, it's certainly open for debate, but tell me what you feel you've been pressured into buying or collecting or listening to, and where you think that pressure's coming from. Because I felt it 20 years ago, before the internet, before the vinyl community existed. I felt a peer pressure, a sense of you need to like this to be a real jazz fan. And maybe that was just all in my head. Maybe I'm just someone who's resistant to suggestion. But again, a lot of people have commented to me over the years saying that they felt the same damn thing. So, in your mind, where's it coming from? And is it coming from all these places? Is it just kind of a residual effect? And of course, part of it's all those records were rare, so that's why they've gotten repressed, because they didn't sell well initially. And now there's enough of the intellectual kind of snobby crowd that wants those records, a couple thousand of them. You know what I mean? And they're not pressing them in huge numbers for the public. A lot of those records get pressed in kind of limited numbers, of course, because there's a limited audience for it. But it only keeps the demand kind of artificially inflated and high. If they press it in big numbers, we quickly see a lot of them getting returned. So enough on that, but it is an interesting debate, I think. And again, the issue here is I want people to love jazz. And if we're always coming across as something that takes such intellectual effort to ingrain yourself in, it's going to keep most of the audience for jazz far away. And that's not what I want to see. I want to see people love this music. In America, especially, in Japan and Australia and the European continent and the UK, people get jazz. I think it's a brilliant American art form, and they value it. America, it's very much a forgotten thing. So I picked up some fun vinyl the other day. I'm going to move into segue into that right now. And I got some fun titles. And the first of them came from my friend in the bass clef, who has a nice little store on Discogs. And I recommend you go to his store and check out some of his great titles. He's actually selling some of his own collection right now to help pay for his schooling. He's going to medical school. And in the bass clef has some great titles. I was searching for something the other day, and I stumbled upon a copy in the store, forgetting that it was his store, actually. Sent him an offer, and then he emailed me saying, "Hey, man, it's me." I'm like, "Oh, cool." And so he actually agreed to sell to me for what he paid for it. And he threw in something else kind of fun, Coleman Hawkins and his All-Stars. And it's a cover I've actually not seen before, but it's a jazz tone release. One of the first jazz tones, actually, which was a mail order record label, and it was originally a 10-inch, I believe. It's got at least 4 or 5 different covers, which Jazz Tone's kind of famous for. This is actually a cover and a version I've not seen before, and it's not even like the first version because again, it was originally 10 inches, and the 10-inch cover is a slight variation of this, but it's got the other kind of Jazz Tone cover with the cover they use a lot with different color shades. I haven't listened to it yet, but again, thank you, my friend. And the other piece I got from him was why I was there in the first place. And I've been kind of digging through the Aladdin label, West Coast label that was pretty important in the 40s, recording Lester Young, the Illinois Jack Cat, and just some of the real giants. Made some great recordings at Aladdin in the 40s. And because it's not the original LPs, I think it diminishes its value in collectors' minds today. But the earliest form I collect is the 10-inch. And so this was the 10-inch version. And this is the first session supervised by Norman Granz. So before Clef, before the JATP, before anything, Norgran Verve, this was the first session he was a part of. And Norman Granz, of course, is he's one of the most important people in the jazz kingdom. I did an episode about him last month. An important character. But this is, like I said, his first sight of production on the Aladdin label. And it's with the great King Cole, which is Nat King Cole, of course, Lester Young, and Red Calendars on the bass. And I love the Aladdin blue, royal blue logo. It's beautiful. And so I was happy to track that down by Norman Granz. I haven't listened to it yet, but again, thank you, my friend. And if you have interest in some good collectible vinyl in bass clef on Discogs, has some great stuff right now. Absolutely check it out. But then I bought another batch of records from a guy in Detroit, and I made him offers on a bunch of stuff. This was on eBay, and I love when I have a chance to make offers because I feel like if you know what you're doing, you can bundle a bunch of offers together and say, accept all my offers or decline all my offers. But if you make enough offers on records that don't have a lot of people looking at them, sometimes you can get a few records that have higher demand in that bundle because the seller is willing to move that other stuff that he's had for so long that no one else is even interested in. So it's a great way to get something you really want by bundling it with some other stuff that you're interested in, making a bunch of offers. And if you're going to make enough offers, I'm talking like 10, 12 offers, I think it's reasonable to go to 50% of the asking price. Maybe 60, 70%, depending on the seller. You have to kind of feel them out. And a lot of times what I'll do, I'll make a record offer on a couple things just to feel them out. And with eBay, they can actually counter offer you. But Discogs, it's one and done, which is kind of annoying. And And actually, what brought me to him was this Eddie Bonamere record, which is on the Roost label, probably from 61 or so, maybe 62. And it's 2241. And in my Roost print off of the label, discography, this one was kind of just a thin narrow line between albums that had all the songs listed. And so I have almost the entire Roost discography up into the early to mid 60s, where it starts to thin out and it starts to become like, it feels like repackaging of earlier stuff from the vaults, because they've sold to Roulette at that point. And so somehow I missed this one, 2241. I love Eddie Bonamere. He's a great Harlem piano player who was also very involved in the Catholic Church, which isn't something you hear a lot of. The Catholicism, jazz, Harlem. You think of the Baptist Church and the evangelicals when you think of the Black Church. You don't think of Catholicism necessarily. But he was actually a very instrumental person in Harlem. And with the backing of the Catholic Church, he actually writes some sacred music, like an Ellington who had. He led a kind of a jazz-inspired song. I don't want to call it praise and worship because that would be incorrect. But like, he kind of does this jazz Catholic music fusion, and I've not heard a lot of it, but this is what I've read. And he, into the 60s and 70s, continues to do this kind of Catholic jazz spiritual music that has some blues in it. And I don't know if it was actually recorded. I don't think it was put out on any jazz labels, but he was very instrumental and pretty famous in that world. But he does do a number of jazz albums on Roost, including a great 10-inch that's hard to find, and a couple of full-length LPs at Bonamere with the candies on it. But this one's always kind of eluded me. And so I watched it on eBay. And if you know eBay well enough, sellers know you're watching their product. And the guy sent me an offer for this. He only wanted $8 to begin with plus shipping. And he sent me an offer of $4 plus shipping. And I was kind of like, I wasn't sure. I knew I wanted it, but I'm sure I could find it in Philadelphia Music or Carolina Soul on their Discog pages. It eventually show up there for a couple bucks. But $4 was pretty reasonable plus shipping. So I'm like, let's see what else this guy has in his store. So I made him an offer, and he offered me this one 50%. So I'm like, okay, there's already a precedent set there. So I offered him, I think, half on this one. I really wanted 20, I think I offered him 12. And this is the great Jimmy Joffrey arranging for Anita O'Day. Cool Heat. Cool cover. It's Verve number 8312. And Joffrey actually has quite a strong presence at Verve in that era, early 60s. He's an incredible-minded, edges of the avant-garde and dissonant using most of that movement guy, Joffrey. But he's also just a brilliant kind of arranger and composer as well. And this one has always kind of eluded me. And he accepted that offer for $12. I already had this one for $4. And then, as I mentioned in my last episode, I've been delving into Brunswick, a cool New Jersey-based label that only has their toe in jazz for a few years. But Basie made a number of records for Brunswick, and I found another one of his, and I think I paid $4 for that as well. And so after I had those 3 LPs, I decided to jump in and see what else he had in his store. And what actually drew my attention the most was some of the guy's 10 inches. And he's from Michigan, and there's a lot of jazz LPs in Michigan. Michigan, Ohio, all those kind of Rust Belt cities had large black populations. And where blacks were in the 50s and 60s does have a lot to do with where black albums are still today. And some other regional labels are very regional still in where you find them. I only got a handful of my 200 plus Savoys from anywhere outside of New Jersey, New York. Like, they were still on that East Coast, most of them. Some people moved across country and brought their vinyl. Most didn't. It's one of the things that most people cleared out when they moved in the 70s. They're like, I'll get the 8 tracks when I go out west. REO Speedwagon has a new record coming out. There's that kind of current connection with music that disconnects us from what we already have collected oftentimes. And when formats change, I think that's even more of an issue. Me and my friend Scott Baldwin were talking about the kind of extinction wall that exists between the 40s and earlier jazz and the 10-inch LP era. Even the labels. There's an extinction era event that after the war, most labels pre-war don't come back, with the exception of a lot of the big ones. And post-war, it's a whole new world of labels. And so even the 40s, 78 era, late 40s after the recording ban ends, up into the 10-inch era, there's an extinction event there again. Now, a lot of those 40s labels don't survive into the 50s. Very few of the great 50s labels have much of a footprint in the 40s. The biggest exception is Savoy. Savoy has some great 50s stuff, but probably even more great 40s recordings. But most of those 50s labels, their footprint might go into the 10-inch era, but very few of them actually go back to the LP era. I mean, the 78 era. And that event is somewhat true for the 60s. There's a lot of labels that are 60s based that don't stretch back into the 50s, but there's far more labels that cross that decade bridge and had a lot of great titles in both. Blue Note has great titles in the 50s and 60s. Prestige has great titles. Pacific, Contemporary. So many of the great labels had great titles in the 50s and 60s. There's very few labels that have great titles in the 40s and 50s. And a lot of the great 40 labels like Keystone, Commodore, Aladdin, Black and White, these labels didn't survive. Dial, all the great Parker recordings, those little labels, most of them don't make it to the 1950s. And if they did, it's the early part of the 50s, and they had a few 10 inches, and they folded with the changing industry, the changing sounds, the changing artists. It was a pretty crazy time in the music industry. It really was. But anyway, I looked at this guy's 10 inches, and he had some cool titles. And so I bundled a bunch of offers together and said, I'm going to make you some lowball offers on these records. They're 10-inch records. A lot of them aren't stuff that people today are collecting. I know that, and you probably will recognize that. Some of them I'm guessing you've had for a long time. So I'm going to make you a bunch of offers on them that I think you'll be okay with as a bundled unit. And if you aren't okay with them, just reject all of them, because this is how I feel comfortable purchasing them. I explained to him I have a YouTube channel. I try to teach people about the history of this music. And so the guy was completely willing to work with me. And I made probably 50% offers on most of them. A few might have been a little over 50, and some might have been a little under 50. But let's go through them real quick. Johnny Dodds, cool. Again, a Brunswick title, which makes this from the early 50s. It says 1950 right there. My eyesight ain't what it used to be. Yeah, 1950. Johnny Dodds was a great New Orleans clarinetist. One of the fantastic, most virtuistic players. Alice Sidney Bechet. Dodds always kind of stayed in the New Orleans tradition. He does have some stuff at Riverside that he recorded during the Dixieland revival of the early mid-50s into the early 60s. But this is a cool title, cool cover, something that reminds me of my grandparents' basement, and only paid a few bucks for it, And so there's history right there that it's just important to have some of these artists. This is Andy Kirk on Chorale. And Chorale, of course, is Decca's jazz-oriented sub-label. And Chorale stuff, Decca stuff is very synonymous. Most of the artists on Chorale might have stuff on Decca as well. Chorale doesn't have a lot of not jazz, which Decca will. Chorale also has some vocal stuff. But the Chorale stuff's pretty good, although it's pretty mainstream and pretty white-oriented. But Andy Kirk and his Clouds of Joy, Souvenir Album Volume 1. Andy Kirk led one of the great swing bands of the 30s and 40s, probably the 30s. And he's a guy I didn't actually have any music by, so I felt like it was time to get something by him. And nice little piece, the Chorale label. And Andy Kirk actually swings pretty hard. So I need to listen to that here coming up. I got a couple things on the Royal label. Duke Ellington, paid a few bucks for both of them. And I have an interesting record by Don Bias, also on the Royal label, called Jazz Greats High Fidelity on Royal. Don Bias, Stan Getz, Earl Bostic. It's from the 78 era. There's 2 Don Bias, 2 Stan Getz, and 4 Earl Bostic tracks. And I'd say it was a cool piece. I've had it for probably a year or so. Looks like I got it from Philadelphia, probably Carolina Soul, actually. So when I saw these 2 Ellingtons on Royal, I'm like, oh shit. It's a little label I know a little bit about already. And I sprung for them, a few bucks. Again, I haven't listened to them yet. These are already all in plastic with paper sleeves, which I definitely appreciate that aspect of them. On Columbia, I got this cool Harry James 10-inch. And Harry James is a fantastic trumpet player from the swing era. He led a big swing band from the mid-40s up into the war, maybe it's a little bit after as well. He has his big break with Benny Goodman, 35, 36 in there somewhere. A great sight reader. They call him a hawk. You put a chart in front of him and he could just read it. Had an incredible dexterity and a wonderful tone. James is one of the great players that today's collectors know very little about. This is on Columbia, number 6009. So it's a pretty early Columbia 10-inch. I figured I'd grab that. Again, I paid a couple bucks for most of these. On Decca now, sorry, not Decca, Epic. And I don't have any Epic 10-inches. I knew they were out there. But Epic Jazz actually is quite expensive. Epic Jazz titles tend to be actually quite expensive, considering that they're part of the Columbia family of records. There's a lot of titles on Epic that are actually quite rare and quite expensive, especially that Charlie Rouse Epic record, which I mentioned earlier. That record on Epic can go for close to $1,000. Took me a long time to track down the Japanese copy I was happy with. But this is Ray McKinley, who's a guy I know of from Savoy. He had a big band of his own on the East Coast for a while. He was a drummer, bit of a character. Here he's playing with a piano player named Will Bradley, doing boogie woogie stuff. And here's Bradley McKinley and Bradley. And I don't really know much about these Bradley characters, if I'm honest. It looks like trumpet and drums, although doing boogie woogie here, you'd think that would be piano. Neither of them say much on the back in terms of who's playing what. I need to listen to them. I can tell you more after I have. But I like Ray McKinley. And again, cool Epic titles. This is Earl Bostic on the Allegro label, which I showed you that Dizzy Gillespie. About 4 or 5 titles of his on Allegro. I mean, just on Allegro. Periods, excuse me. It also has Jimmy Lunsford on it. And Lunsford led a big band of his own that was a fantastic hard swinging group in the 30s and into the 40s, I think. But Bostic was a training ground for John Coltrane. Bostic led a jump blues outfit that was kind of crossover R&B soul jazz, not soul jazz, but R&B jazz. The early days of that movement with Louis Jordan and Tiny Bradshaw. Bostic was a real figure in that scene. Bostic plays the alto. Was one of the greatest players ever that John Coltrane said he listened to. Was super influenced by Bostic, even though he plays kind of a more melancholic, commercially viable brand of jazz than Coltrane ever really encompasses himself. Bostic's stuff's always quite commercially appealing and sold well. That's why you can find his stuff for fairly cheap. He made a lot of great recordings on the King label. Bostic's really an important piece in the movement of the jazz canon into R&B. Just a really great player that's really overlooked today. And you can find Bostic stuff for very affordable prices. Next, I found 2 of the more collectible pieces I really wanted. Was these 2 MRC 10 inches by Swedish baritone player, Lars Gulen. And I have his stuff on Atlantic and on East West and a few other places I got some Lars Gulen. He's a great player, one of the great baritones that you kind of don't think about initially. Think Serge Chaloff, a great tone. The baritone lends itself to having great tone. It's just a real rich sounding instrument to begin with. I think I have both of these musically on the 12-inch reissue on MRC, 36,000 series. But to get these original covers for a handful of dollars, to get these early 50s renditions of the great Chicago Emerson label. Lars is a great player. He dabbles in bebop. He looks like he's probably recording in Sweden with Rolf Berg, George Rydell, and Robert Edmond. So this could have been in America. It's hard to say. But most of the time, these guys recorded over there, and we just have this stuff licensed here. And then this title here is pretty much all the Swedish players, with here Bjorn Nurm, Aka Persson, Putte Wickman, Bengt Hallberg, again George Rydell and Robert Edmond. So maybe those two guys were over there. Hard to say, because George Rydell and Robert Edmond doesn't sound like Swedish young men. I know some of these Swedish names actually from hockey as a kid. Bengt Gustafsson. There was a lot of those guys coming into the NHL in the 70s and 80s. Boria Solomon was one of the first to really come across. So I was happy to get those two Emerson titles. And then one thing I was really kind of excited about was this. Ralph Burns on the Period label, which again is Leonard Feather's label. And it wasn't long for this world. Which is funny because I have an Al Haig 12-inch album with pretty much the same cover, just with different words. Probably should show you that to you. I mean, talk about your graphic design department needing some variants. I'm guessing this was probably 10 inches. Well, I'm pretty sure it was. This was period 1104. This is period 1105. So back-to-back releases had the same graphic, which, I mean, if it was volume 1 and 2 of the same artist, maybe. But Al Haig Quartet versus the Ralph Burns and his ensemble, very different. And this, of course, is something I'm pretty sure that Bethlehem actually reissued. Possibly as that album Bijou, if I remember. Because Bethlehem buys up a lot of the period jazz. And there's a string of records that come out, probably 58 or so on Bethlehem, including some of that Mingus stuff, some of that Charlie Shaver stuff, that Maxine Sullivan, that was all stuff from period. And Bethlehem reissued it under different titles with different covers. But the old period stuff's kind of important, and when you stumble on it, you got to grab it. And again, I didn't pay a lot for this. It's got the old period label, logo. And so I felt it was a nice little addition to my period collection. I think I now have 6 or 7 period titles. Of course, there's that great record by, one second, I'm drawing a blank. Mad Thad by the great Thad Jones. That's what I was thinking, but for some reason it didn't sound right. You know what I mean? We get old enough, we start questioning our own sanity. I love Thad Jones, brother of Elvin and Hank Jones, a great trumpet player. And I'm pretty sure this was also a 10-inch initially. Pretty tough record to come by in any kind of original state. This is a Japanese repress, if I recall. But again, Leonard Feather was doing some pretty interesting stuff at period at that point. And then he decided to move on. And period sold their stock to Bethlehem, which Bethlehem then reissued. It's good stuff. So all in all, I got a nice little pile of 10-inch LPs. I think I probably paid $40 for this bunch, maybe 50. And then, of course, I paid something else for those LPs, which I told you about. So again, a fun little delve into the history. It's a great way to kind of connect with some of the artists and names that are out there that you hear about but you don't know. You can go out there and bundle some stuff together and get to know some of these legends that are equally important to the Lee Morgans and the Hank Mobleys and the Miles Davises. And Blue Note, for all of its glory and importance, and as much as I've praised Blue Note over the years, the more you understand the history of the jazz canon, the more you realize how much of a small chapter Blue Note was. And I'm going to probably take a little heat for this, but the Ken Burns jazz documentary, turns out, was right. The Ellington, the Armstrong, the Basie, the Holiday, the Fitzgerald, that whole first 6-7 episodes of that documentary, that is the big body of the music. That's when it was popular. That's when it was selling millions of copies. That's when it was America's pop music. It's important to emphasize the breadth and dimension of that music and how important it was in this country, helping us through the Depression, helping us through the war years, helping us bridge the race gap. Jazz doesn't start with Miles Davis. doesn't start with Blue Note. These are small chapters that came at the end of the music as the popularity waned. And we think Miles Davis is one of the greatest selling jazz record artists, which he is. But when you compare to the popularity of what happened in the swing era in the 30s during the Depression, those records were selling millions of copies. Miles Davis at Columbia was lucky to sell 100,000. And when his records didn't sell well, like Seven Steps to Heaven and some of those early 60s records, his sales would drop to 40, 50,000 with that big distribution. So as important as he's elevated into the eyes of people today, historically, he is a bit of a footnote. And he's a link to people's today collecting jazz. So I'm not diminishing what he's done. I'm just saying when you understand how big jazz was, how many names there are, how much of that music kind of carries into the 50s and 60s via the players themselves, recording at the JATP, recording for Norman Granz, recording at Prestige on Moodsville and Swingsville. These artists didn't just disappear. Most of the black ones especially played until they died. The white ones seemed to move on into film and television and the Vegas lounge acts, and the white cats, a lot of them leave music totally. Most of the black musicians either die or play into their old age and die. I mean, there's just not a lot of examples of a guy like Buddy Collette, who got into Hollywood as one of the first black crossover artists into that industry. He was a real rarity and an exception. So, interesting stuff, man. It's interesting stuff, getting to know that history. And like I said, it turns out that Ken Burns got it right. That Blue Note is kind of a small chapter at the end of the book. An alternate ending. And the free jazz avant-garde movement going into the 60s and 70s was even a smaller footprint in terms of audience and people who gave a shit about it. And how that's all been so shifted today by how we see what's important in jazz and who we think matters in jazz. It is strange. So that's the new stuff I got. Fun stuff. Again, answer those two questions. Do you feel like there's peer pressure in jazz? And where do you feel like it comes from the most? Have you bought something based off other people's expectations or impressions that you felt like you had to have and got home and tried to listen to it a few times and I'm like, I just don't like it? Or have you never really cared what other people say? Like I said, I feel like I was definitely influenced and pushed into certain things that I didn't really like or get. And to say it takes years to get it, that's not a valid interpretation. It shouldn't take you years to like something. You didn't end up liking it, you just got used to it. And so I could feed you shit every day for 10 years, and by the end of those 10 years you'd find some redeeming qualities. You could work in a steel mill with pounding hammers and all this cacophony of sound and learn to hear the music in that. Learn to hear the rhythms and the patterns and the tonalities in a steel mill. You know, and Black Sabbath and Judas Priest out of Manchester, these guys often talked about the industrial side of manufacturing in the UK and how that influenced a lot of the trudging and rhythmic pulsing and sounds of early heavy metal. And that was part of even where the name was forged from. No pun on words there. So anyway, fun stuff. Your thoughts on that question. And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong here. Me and Ken had a fun discussion about it. And I think maybe some of you can comment and share some of your stories so I can show Ken that there are people who do feel pressured into buying things. There are people who do feel pressured into liking certain things. And again, I don't know necessarily where it's coming from. So y'all have a great day. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. If you want to support the channel, please go to my Patreon page and pledge a few dollars a month. It helps out. We're in a difficult transition phase right now. We don't have a lot of income coming in. We're trying to build out this coffee shop. Contractors are going to be coming in here during the next month. And we're trying to bridge that gap until the place opens. And even then, we don't really know what kind of profits or earnings we're going to make. It's a small town after all. We're hoping the charm and the uniqueness can draw in special event people and really make this a destination place for art showings and poetry readings and music and maybe some DJ sets. So we're hoping we can create that atmosphere. But there's no guarantees in this world. Everything is a risk, but life requires risk at times. So again, wish us bon voyage, bona fortuna, peace and safety to all my people. Love you guys, all of you. Thank you for all your support. Thank you for your Patreon support. Your comments are always loved and appreciated. I try to respond to as many as I can. You know what I mean? There's certain episodes where I don't feel like the responses are necessary, but for most episodes I engage and try to respond to every comment. I do appreciate that. And it's nice to interact with people and get to know people and to see where they're coming from. I try to be as personable and as part of the community as I can be. I don't ever really see myself as above. I see myself as having maybe learned some of the stuff first, and I'm just going to share what I just learned. And that's a lot of what my channel has always been about. I'm sharing excitedly things I'm learning. And so the infinite well of knowledge that some of y'all think I am, the records have done most of that teaching. The collection speaks for itself, and my base of knowledge is mostly under having just chronicalized and sequentialized all that data in my mind. So I see things label-wise, I see things chronologically by order, by year, by label. I have a lot of that stuff kind of just from the data the records have provided. So appreciate you all again. Y'all be safe. Talk to y'all soon. Peace.